Hello friends, my name is Katey and I am filming this video today on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, the sovereignty of which was never ceded. I'd like to express my solidarity and allegiance with the traditional and rightful owners of this land and with Indigenous people across this continent and beyond. I'm sharing this video with you today because coming up very soon on the 26th of January is what is commonly known as Australia Day. It's a public holiday here in this country that commemorates and celebrates the invasion and occupation. It became an official public holiday sometime in the 1990s, but since at least the 1930s, Indigenous people have seen this day and have been actively protesting this day as a day of mourning, a day of survival, a day of invasion. Now, I'm not going to get into the entire history of colonization in this country here in this video, but I think it is fair at least to say, at the very least, that until Australia genuinely reckons with its past of colonization, of genocide, until there is genuine truth-telling and treaty, I personally feel that it is grotesque to celebrate a day like Australia Day. And for that reason, I, along with tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, will be marching on the 26th of January. If you're in Australia, especially if you're in a capital city, there is absolutely a rally near you, and I hope you join us. It is always important. Invasion Day is the biggest day of protest for Aboriginal people here in this country, but I think especially in the wake of the failure of the Voice referendum, it is especially important that those of us who are not Indigenous, who are settlers to this land, show up in solidarity on the 26th of January. Of course, if you're not able to get to a rally, there are so many other ways to show solidarity. If for some reason you're working, if you are somebody who does not rely on those penalty rates to, pay your rent, pay for food, if the penalty rates are basically a bonus for you, then I would encourage you to be donating or giving that money to Indigenous grassroots organisations. If you have the capacity, I would absolutely be encouraging you to seek out and learn more about Pay the Rent in your local area. It's basically an initiative that makes it very easy for settlers like me to redistribute some of our wealth, which is something I have been doing for the last 4 or 5 years, and I'm committed to doing for as long as I am earning money. But this is a booktube channel, so of course I've got some book recommendations for you. I have made a handful of other videos recommending Aboriginal and Indigenous authors and their books, so I will leave a link to those videos in the description box below. Feel free to check them out if you want even more recommendations. I have 5 books by Indigenous authors that I wanted to share with you today, and 1 bonus book that I feel like is relevant. And there is a huge range here. We've got some poetry, we've got some non-fiction, we've got some collections, we've got some picture books. These are not necessarily all new books, but they're all books that I have read in the last year or so. One of my most recent reads is Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia. This is edited by Anita Heiss. If you're in Australia and you read books and you go to bookshops, you've probably seen books that are kind of part of this unofficial series. This Growing Up in Australia series, there's a whole host of them about a bunch of different experiences. There's Growing Up Disabled in Australia, there's Growing Up Queer, Asian, African, Muslim. It's a great series, and I think this book, published in 2018, was one of the earlier additions to it. Basically, the point of this series is that people from a lived experience get to share about that lived experience. And what I love about this series and this book is that we get such a great range of experiences. There are people that you probably know the name of who are famous writers and authors. For example, we've got entries by Tony Birch, Adam Goods, Celeste Little, Amy Maguire, Amberlynn Quay-Mulliner, and Tara June Winch, and so many more. But then we also have a bunch of entries by people who have never had anything published before. My absolute favourite entry was one of the earlier ones. It's on page 26 and it's called Dear Australia by Don Bemrose. And it's an essay that is structured as a letter to Australia, and it is biting. It was incredible. There is also now an audiobook version of this book available, which is great, makes it just that little bit more accessible. And obviously, while this is a collection with a very diverse range of voices represented, there are certainly some themes that come up again and again. I think one of the big ones in this collection in particular was around the concept of Aboriginal identity itself, especially that given the history of genocide and assimilation, the stolen generations, there are some people whose, grandparents were part of the stolen generation, and so their own experience of their culture has, been affected by that. But then there are also voices from people who were part of the stolen generation, because obviously this is not something that happened centuries and centuries ago. It's something that only officially ended a couple of decades ago. And I say officially because today, more children than ever are being removed from their homes and their communities. So if you are looking for just a very broad range of experiences and the kind of book that you can dive in and out of, a lot of these entries are only a handful of pages long. The vast majority of them are written in a very down-to-earth colloquial kind of tone, so it's very easy to read. But there's also a handful of them that do play with format. Like I said, there's one that's written as a letter to Australia. We've also got one where 2 sisters kind of interview each other. There's a couple that are even written in verse. It's just a really great, interesting, powerful collection that I I highly recommend. Speaking of poetry, the next book that I wanted to recommend you is a poetry collection. This is called Dropbear. This is a book that has been widely celebrated. It won some very prestigious awards, and I can absolutely appreciate why. It was a debut work, and it is presented as a poetry collection primarily, but there's a lot of other kind of mishmash formats thrown in as well. There's some kind of like free verse essays. There's some more traditional structured kind of essays as well, although all of them are very short and punchy. I'd say overall this is quite an incredible work of satire. A lot of it's basically taking the piss out of Australian iconography and like the concept of Australia and Australian identity more generally, especially in the context of all of that national identity being built on a falsehood of terra nullius. There's a lot of poems and essays in here that are quite mournful, are quite emotional. A lot of them are very reflective on the past. But like I said, a lot of them also are just really quite funny and powerful. I think the entry that probably gets referenced the most is the one I want to talk to you about today. It's called Acknowledgement of Country. Which is obviously a play on acknowledgement of country. And it's basically satirizing and mocking in a lot of ways the hollowness of a lot of the symbology around an acknowledgement of country, and how for a lot of people and corporations who do acknowledgements of countries because they have to, a lot of the time they clearly lack any intention or meaning or feeling behind them and are essentially performative. Now, we all know that I'm not necessarily the biggest poetry reader, but I feel like this is the kind of poetry collection that I want to return to. It's the kind of poetry collection that honestly feels like somebody's manifesto, their magnum opus. And while I absolutely loved it upon my first read, I know that there is so much more that I have yet to kind of uncover and experience. This is layered, I suppose is what I'm saying. There's a lot here, and I thought it was hugely powerful. It's a poetry collection filled to the brim with grief, with anger, but also with perseverance, hope, and defiance. Defiance, I suppose, is the best word that I want to use to describe this. I think it's incredible. Next up, we have the book that was my first 5-star of 2024, and I just love it. So I'm about to gush. It is Dear Son. This is a collection that was edited and compiled by Thomas Mayer. In this absolutely incredibly moving collection, we have 12 Indigenous men, that's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, who are basically writing letters either to their fathers or to their sons, talking about their experience and their understanding of masculinity within the context of both their own cultures and colonization. Honestly, it could be seen as a very gentle, tender, brave exploration of decolonizing masculinity. Each of the letters is only like kind of 5 to 10 pages long, but they're all just so vulnerable and tender. The way that they talk to their sons or to their fathers in such an understanding, generous, open-hearted kind of way, both exploring their own experiences of masculinity and the struggles that they have faced and maybe where they've fallen short, but also exploring what they hope for their sons and for their children and generations to come. It's such an honest, reflective piece of work that these men have collectively created that I'm honestly just in awe of. And all of them talk about this experience in very different ways, in very personal ways, but one of the themes that did come up with at least 2 or 3 of the authors was discussing the harm of colonization, and in particular the Northern Territory intervention and some of the really racist dialogue that we saw around that. The Northern Territory intervention is a whole conversation in and of itself, but essentially human rights legislation was stood down and overridden so that the army could go into the Northern Territory and basically enforce a bunch of laws specifically on Indigenous people. The justification largely centered around alcohol abuse and domestic violence and violence against women. And we know that the effects of the Northern Territory intervention were much more harmful than they were helpful to these communities and to these people. But in particular, the way that the men talk about the demonization of Aboriginal men and the way that they were painted to be these violent, abusive animals, and how this really impacted their own sense of self, their own sense of masculinity, and the ways that they felt like they could interact with the women in their lives and with the children in their lives. How essentially Aboriginal men, especially in the Northern Territory, were painted as criminals who were inherently violent and could not be trusted, which is obviously hugely racist and just so harmful, both at a community level, but here we see how it's so harmful on a personal and interpersonal level too. And while this book obviously does tackle some of those harder subjects like I've just spoken about, ultimately the tone, I cannot stress enough, is so tender. This is a book whose creation so clearly came from a place of pure, unadulterated love. Hurt and grief and sadness too, but love first. Like I said, it was my first 5-star of the year, and honestly, it's one of my favorite books that I've ever read. I cannot recommend it more highly. Genuinely, please read this book. Now, to kind of go along and reinforce some of the themes that we just spoke about with Dear Son, I also wanted to recommend a book that is not by an Indigenous author. It is White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. Ruby is a Lebanese Australian author, and this is honestly just one of the most important books that I've ever read. And while she is not Aboriginal or Indigenous herself, many of the themes and topics that she explores are very, very clearly relevant to this country. But on top of that, she does actually explore several examples of colonization here in Australia to back up her arguments. And I think especially when we're talking about the villainization, the criminalization of black and brown men, the way that this is literally a weapon of white supremacy and the way that white women are complicit, indeed active participants in all of this. And then of course the harm that that does, not only to black and brown communities more generally, but black and brown men. So obviously in this video we are focusing on Aboriginal voices, but I just could not help but recommend this book alongside. As far as anti-racism and anti-colonial books go, I think this is a must read. Now finally, to lighten it up, I did also want to recommend you two beautiful picture books. Obviously picture books are targeted to young children, but I think they can also be hugely impactful for people of any age. The first one I wanted to suggest is a story. This is Owl and Star by Helen Milroy. The illustrations in here are so beautiful. It's just such a sweet story. It's basically about an owl who loves watching the stars, and in particular he has one favorite star, but one night when he's looking up at the sky, his favorite star isn't there anymore. So he goes on this little adventure to find her and put her back in the sky where she belongs. It's literally as sweet and as beautiful as it sounds, and the illustrations are so vibrant and vivid. It is one of those picture books that's a little longer, a little wordier, so I would say it's targeted to kids who are sort of like 4+, especially those ones who want to sit for a little bit of a longer story. It's just such a sweet story and I love it. The final picture book I wanted to recommend to you is a non-fiction book that is obviously, again, targeted towards kids, but it's one of those non-fiction picture books that I think is perfect for people of any age. And in fact, I have actually given this book to adults who are kind of like starting to realize that Australia is a racist colony, but aren't necessarily big readers or aren't really ready for those larger, longer books. This one is Somebody's Land by Adam Goodes and Ellie Liang, and actually there are kind of like a couple of books in this little series, I suppose now. They're all great, but I think Somebody's Land is just such an important and incredible, powerful place to start. It's essentially a beautiful, colourful, illustrated picture book that challenges the lie of terra nullius. So we get to learn a little bit about Aboriginal culture, but also the immense history of Aboriginal culture and connection to land. And throughout there is the repetition of the refrain, when the white people came, they called the land terra nullius. They said it was nobody's land, but it was somebody's land. For those who don't know, terra nullius is Latin for essentially no man's land, and it is what the British used for justification for their invasion and occupation and subsequent genocide of what is now called Australia. So this book is essentially an incredible, accessible introduction to that concept and to the fact that it was a lie, to the very clear falseness of it. So those are the books that I have to recommend you today in the lead up to this year's Invasion Day. As I said, I have made other videos along these lines over the years, so I will leave links to those in the description box below if you want even more recommendations. I will also leave some other relevant information in the description box below, so please check it out. I hope you enjoyed these recommendations. I hope this encourages you to pick up a book and read it on Invasion Day. Learning more and supporting Aboriginal artists and authors is always important, but please also make sure that you're getting involved in Aboriginal resistance however you can. A big thank you as always goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown and Marie. But that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. All that's left to say is always was, always will be Aboriginal land.